The ballroom held its breath the moment he moved. She was standing behind the long curtain at the east wall of Viscount Holt's assembly room, holding a folded program in both hands and trying to be smaller than she already was, when the Duke of Ashbourne turned from Lady Cecily Darnwell, crossed 15 feet of polished floor, and bowed. Not the shallow inclination a gentleman offered a servant, not the brief nod he might extend to a tradesman's wife who had wandered into the wrong corridor. A full, deliberate bow, his dark head dropping to precisely the angle the season reserved for its equals, his shoulders level, his attention absolute, as though the curtain and the program and the plain gray gown were no impediment at all to his seeing her. The music had not stopped. The musicians went on drawing their bows across their strings with the mechanical patience of men paid to provide a backdrop. What stopped was everything else. The fans stilled. The murmuring broke apart into separate held silences. Lady Cecily's smile remained on her face, the way a candle flame remains for one moment after it has been blown out. Mira Voss did not move. She was 24 years old and had spent 3 seasons attending other women into rooms she was not permitted to truly enter, and nothing in that training had prepared her for a duke's eyes, finding her face, and staying there. She did not know, standing behind that curtain in the spring of 1814, that the season would not recover its shape after that bow. She could not have known. All she knew, in the breath before the world reorganized itself around her, was the specific quality of his stillness, and the fact that her own heartbeat had become audible somewhere in the column of her throat. That was the moment. But the moment had a long history, and to understand what it meant, one must go back a little further than the bow. Mira had arrived at number 14, Welbeck Street, as a lady's companion to Baroness Holt in February of that year, having answered a notice in the Morning Post with a letter so precisely correct in its register that the Baroness had hired her without an interview. The Baroness required someone to accompany her to assemblies, to carry her shawl, to answer correspondence when her neuralgia made writing difficult, and to be present without being visible. In those requirements, Mira was well practiced. She had been invisible for most of her adult life. Her father, a country clergyman of the better sort, had died the previous autumn with a library full of good books, a genuine warmth toward his parishioners, and £240 of unpaid school fees accruing against her younger brother Thomas's continued education at his academy in Bath. The library had been sold. The furniture had followed. The house in Wiltshire had reverted to the living's next incumbent before December was out, and Mira had packed the things that fit into a single trunk and gone north toward London with the kind of calm that takes up residence in the body when grief has nowhere left to go. Thomas was 15 and quick-minded, and the £240 was not a figure the Baroness's salary could reach in anything under a year of careful saving, and Mira knew it. She had written the number at the top of a piece of paper the first week in Welbeck Street, and kept the paper folded inside the cover of the small copy of Johnson's dictionary that had been the only book she had managed to keep. The number was not an abstraction. It had a name attached to it, Thomas, in his academy's dormitory, writing her letters in a hand still not quite fully formed, asking when he might see her, and not quite asking what would happen if the fees went unpaid. That paper, and the weight it represented, was what Mira carried into every room she attended the Baroness through. It was what she was carrying, folded inside the cover of everything she thought about her own future. When Baroness Holt swept her through the doors of Viscount Holt's assembly room on the first great night of the season, and a duke looked up from the most celebrated young woman in London and found, instead, her. The Baroness had not noticed. She rarely noticed Mira unless Mira was failing to anticipate something. She moved directly toward the hostess, and Mira moved with her, and then fell back in the way she had learned to fall back, into the margin of the room, near the curtain. near the wall, carrying the program and watching the machinery of the season assemble itself around Lady Cecily Darnwell. Cecily was 19 and possessed of a fortune her father had accumulated through 3 consecutive fortunate speculations, and the Ton had decided early in January that she was the diamond of this particular season. She wore white and diamonds, the diamonds real, the white undeniably new, and she moved through the room with the particular confidence of someone who had been told, often and by credible sources, that the room was arranged for her benefit. The Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, Edmund's mother, had already been seen in private consultation with Cecily's chaperone, a thin woman named Mrs. Carew, who was some distant connection of the family. The match was considered inevitable by everyone with access to good gossip. A duke required an heir, and Cecily required a title, and the dowager required a daughter-in-law whose fortune and lineage closed no doors. Mira had heard all of this in the corridor of Welbeck Street, where the Baroness conducted what she believed were private conversations with her particular friends, while Mira sat in an adjacent chair pretending to attend to some mending. She had heard it, and filed it in the category of information that did not concern her, and gone on saving toward £240. And then the Duke had crossed the floor and bowed, and the category system she had built around herself had developed its first crack. He said nothing. That was the first detail she noticed through the shock of his attention. He had bowed, and now he was standing upright again, and he was looking at her with gray eyes the color of river water in November. And he was not speaking. She had the peculiar sensation that he was waiting for something, though she could not have said what. "Your Grace," she managed, because the period required something, and the word was at least technically correct. He inclined his head. Not the bow again, just the inclination one offered in acknowledgement. Then, without a word of explanation to anyone in the vicinity, he turned and walked toward the far end of the room where a group of senior gentlemen had collected near the windows. The Baroness found Mira approximately 6 minutes later, her eyes very bright with something that was not quite pleasure. "What on earth did you do?" she said, and it was not a question. It was an accusation wearing a question's dress. "Nothing," Mira said. "I was standing still." The Baroness looked at her with the expression she reserved for things that created problems she had not anticipated. "You were standing too still," she said, and moved away. That, precisely, was what the season had always said about Mira Voss. Too still, too quiet, too plain in a room that rewarded noise and color. She had heard a version of it on the second evening of the season, when Lady Alderton, a stout woman in purple silk who was intimate with the dowager, had said to a companion near the refreshments table, without lowering her voice to the degree the occasion required, "The Baroness's companion? The gray one? Nobody, my dear. She has been standing in this family's corridors for years, and nobody has ever learned her name." She had heard it again a week later, at a smaller assembly at the home of Sir Reginald Pell, when one of the young officers in attendance had pointed her out to his friend and said, laughing quietly, "That is Miss Voss. She attends Old Holt. She is the kind of woman who passes through a season without disturbing it. I have seen her 3 times, and I cannot tell you the color of her eyes." The color of her eyes was brown, a warm and specific brown, like the pages of a much-consulted book. But the officer had not been wrong about the passing through. That was what she did. That was what she had learned to do. From the first season she had attended the Baroness, when she had understood that her role was to be useful and to be absent, and that these were the same thing. The witnessing happened on a Tuesday, at a gathering of no particular distinction, hosted by a Mrs. Fellows in a house on the edge of Mayfair, whose pretensions slightly exceeded its proportions. Mira had arrived with the Baroness and had been directing herself, as usual, toward the nearest unoccupied corner when she came through the servants' passage into the side corridor and found a small child of perhaps 3 years old sitting on the stone floor and weeping with the absolute desperation of someone who had lost something irreplaceable. The child was a girl. Her father, it emerged from the fragmentary account she was able to give between sobs, was a footman in Mrs. Fellowes' service, and she had been brought along today by her mother, who was a kitchen maid, and she had been carrying her father's miniature, a small painted portrait on ivory that he kept of his own mother, and she had dropped it somewhere in the corridor and could not find it. And she was very small, and the corridor was very long, and the miniature was very small too. Mira set the Baroness's evening wrap on the nearest chair and went down on her knees on the stone floor in the gray gown that was already not appropriate to the occasion, and she looked. It was behind the wooden chest against the wall, which she reached by lying on her side on the cold stone. Her arm extended into the gap, her fingers finding the edge of the ivory case in the dark. She retrieved it, pressed it into the child's hands, and helped the child to her feet. She did not know, in that moment, that anyone had seen this. The Duke of Ashbourne had arrived early to Mrs. Fellowes' gathering because his steward had sent word that his presence was required at a meeting of landowners in the same quarter of Mayfair before the evening proper began, and he had come through the same servants' passage as a shortcut from the east door. He had stopped at the corner of the corridor, and he had stood there, very still, and he had watched a young woman he had seen once before at Viscount Holt's assembly lie down on a stone floor in an evening gown to retrieve a footman's miniature for a weeping child. He did not speak. He did not move until she had risen, brushed the dust from her sleeve with a composure that struck him as more practiced than casual, lifted the Baroness's wrap, and turned to carry it back toward the drawing-room. When she turned, she saw him, and stopped. His face gave her nothing. It was, she had noted before, a face that had made a deliberate peace with restraint, the jaw set, the gray eyes level, the line of his mouth carrying no particular expression. She had heard, in the corridors of Welbeck Street, that the Duke was cold, that he had been cold since his first wife died, 2 years before, in circumstances the polite world chose not to specify, that the Dowager had spent those 2 years managing his coldness toward the question of a second marriage with the systematic patience of a general conducting a slow siege. She gave him a small curtsy, the correct inclination for a companion in the presence of a duke, and moved past him without speaking, because she had nothing to say that would not make the situation worse. He let her go. He did not call after her. He stood in the corridor for a moment longer, and then he went to his meeting, and he sat through it with less attention than he had given to a gray gown disappearing around a corner. There are particular evenings in a man's life that he understands, before they are over, to be hinge points. He had understood the evening his first wife, Eleanor, had told him she was with child as a hinge point, and he had celebrated it, and then departed for Westminster the following morning on a matter of drainage legislation that affected 600 tenant families across 3 counties, and had seemed, in the calculus of the powerful, to matter more than any individual event at home. Eleanor had died 31 hours later, before he reached Ashbourne, in an accouchement that had gone wrong in the 3rd hour and found no one in the house with sufficient authority to send for a better physician in time. He had stood in the corridor outside her room and looked at the turned portrait, its face to the wall where the housekeeper had placed it in the old tradition, and he had understood in his body, in a way he could not dismantle or reason away, that he had chosen incorrectly. that the correct choice had been available to him, that he had weighed it against 600 tenant families and found it lighter, and that the weight of that misjudgment would not leave him. He had kept the portrait turned. It was small, framed in dark wood, and it hung in the corridor outside the study at Ashbourne, and he had not restored it to its proper position in the 2 years since. He did not mourn Eleanor loudly. The ton read his silence as coldness. His mother read it as an inconvenient obstacle to remarriage. Edmund himself read it as the minimum courtesy owed to a woman he had failed. He had not, in the 2 years since Eleanor's death, made any decision of personal significance quickly. He considered. He observed. He waited until he was certain. And then he waited longer. Because he had learned, in a corridor outside a room he had not been in time to reach, what the cost of misplaced certainty could be. This was not information that Mira possessed, standing in the corridor with a footman's miniature just retrieved and a duke's gray eyes moving across her face. She possessed only the understanding that his attention was inexplicable and very probably a mistake, and that mistakes of this kind corrected themselves quickly. She filed it in the same category as the bow, a thing that had happened, and that she must not allow herself to build upon. The Dowager moved on a Thursday evening at a public supper hosted by Lord Fenwick at his house in St. James's Square. Lord Fenwick was 73 years old and a former Lord Privy Seal, and the kind of figure whose drawing rooms constituted a form of public record. His supper was attended by 40 people of sufficient standing that every arrangement made within it would be noted, repeated, and accepted as fact by the following Monday. It was the Dowager who had suggested the supper to Lord Fenwick. In the gentle, inexorable way she had of suggesting things to elderly men who admired her. And it was the Dowager who had arranged that Lady Cecily would be seated to Edmund's left, and that their introduction, which had thus far been managed in private settings that offered him the option of brevity, would occur tonight, under conditions that made brevity look like rudeness. Mira sat at the far end of the table, between the Baroness and a retired colonel who was slightly deaf, and she watched it happen. Cecily was radiant in gold silk, and she was intelligent enough to be interesting, and she spoke to Edmund with the ease of someone who understood herself to be the correct answer to a question he had been asked. Edmund listened. He was polite. His jaw kept its set line, and his eyes carried no particular expression. But he was present in the conversation in a way that Mira had no business reading. She was reading it anyway, which was its own small disaster. The Baroness leaned toward her during the third remove and said, low enough that only Mira could hear, "There is your Duke, Miss Voss. It appears his attention this fortnight has landed where it always was going to land." She smiled, not unkindly, because she was not a cruel woman, only a practical one. He was amusing himself with the season's variety. Men of his rank often do, before they settle. Mira looked at her plate. The word amusing moved through her like cold water, and she let it settle, because it was the sensible word, and she had always known the sensible word applied. She did not speak to him that evening. The next morning, the signed letter arrived. It came to the Baroness's house, addressed to the Dowager's connections, and Mira learned of it not through any direct disclosure, but through the parlor door, which stood an inch ajar while she was returning the Baroness's shawl to its hook in the hall. The Baroness was speaking with her particular friend, Mrs. Alderton, and Mrs. Alderton was reading from what was apparently a note she had received from the Dowager's secretary. "A letter of intention," Mrs. Alderton said, "with the satisfaction of someone delivering information, for which they have waited some weeks. Toward Lady Cecily. The Dowager presented it to His Grace at breakfast, and he has not refused it." "Has he accepted?" the Baroness asked. A pause. "He has not refused it," Mrs. Alderton said again. Mira hung the shawl on its hook and walked up the stairs to her room at the top of the house, where the ceiling sloped down over the narrow bed and the single window looked out onto the backs of the houses in the next street. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she looked at the wall. And she thought, with the careful precision she had brought to every painful calculation of the past year, through what she knew to be true. She had nothing. She had a trunk of clothing, a copy of Johnson's dictionary with a piece of paper inside it, on which 240 pounds was written, and a situation in a house where her presence was defined entirely by her usefulness. She had been bowed to at an assembly, and she had been observed in a corridor by a man whose gray eyes had stayed on her face for a moment longer than she could account for. She had built nothing on this. She had been careful not to. She had known, with every sensible faculty available to her, that the bow was an aberration, and the attention was a man's temporary diversion, and that the correct interpretation of Lady Alderton's words in a refreshments queue was the one that had always applied. Nobody, my dear. She drew the dictionary toward her and opened the cover and took out the piece of paper. She set it aside. She took a fresh sheet from the small supply she kept for correspondence, and she picked up her pen, and she wrote a letter. She wrote it to him because there was no one else to write it to. She wrote it plainly, because plain honesty was the one thing she had never been able to stop owning, even when it cost her. She wrote that she understood the season's correct arrangement, and that she wished him well in it. She wrote that if any part of his attention toward her across the preceding weeks had carried obligation, he was released from it entirely, because she had never understood herself to have a claim on anyone's notice, and she did not intend to begin now. She wrote that she was grateful for the small civilities he had shown her, and that she would ask him to accept her departure from the season as the most convenient arrangement for everyone concerned. She and the Baroness could remove to the Holt property in Derbyshire before the month was out. There was no reason for inconvenience. She signed it, folded it, and addressed it. She sent it by the morning post the following day, because she did not have the nerve to send it by hand. He received it at 10 o'clock in the morning, sitting at the desk in his library in Grosvenor Square with a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside it. His secretary had placed it among the ordinary correspondence, and he had opened it without anticipation, expecting a solicitor's note or an inquiry about a tenant matter. He read it once, quickly, and then he read it again, more slowly. What struck him was not the release from obligation, which he had not required. What struck him was the word departure, and the phrase the most convenient arrangement for everyone concerned, and underneath both of those, legible as a watermark in the paper, the absolute conviction that her own removal was the natural solution. That she had never understood herself to have a claim on anyone's notice. He set the letter on the desk. He sat with it for a long time. He thought about a corridor at Mrs. Fellowes' house, and a gray gown, and a small child's face clearing from misery into relief. He thought about a woman who told difficult truths because she could not stop owning them, even when the truth cost her the only thing she might have had. He thought about Eleanor, and about the turned portrait, and about what it meant to choose the wrong weight in a scale. Then he sent a note to his valet, and he sent another to his steward at Ashbourne containing certain instructions regarding a school in Bath and a debt of £240, and he put on his coat. The Holt assembly was that evening. The Baroness had already committed to it before Mira's letter had arrived, and Mira attended because the Baroness required her to attend, and because she had not yet arranged the removal to Derbyshire, and because she was attempting not to hope for anything. She wore the gray gown. She had one other, a pale blue that had been altered twice, and still did not fit precisely in the shoulders. but she wore the gray because it was what she wore to functions of this kind, and because she was not attending as a guest. She stood at the edge of the room near the long window, holding the Baroness's fan, watching the season continue its arrangements. Lady Cecily arrived in ivory and garnets. She was accompanied by her chaperone and by the dowager, who wore black pearls and carried a fan made of painted chicken skin that she used with the precision of a conductor's baton. The dowager was 58 years old and had managed the Carew family's social position through 2 dukes and one extremely complicated inheritance dispute, and she carried that authority in every angle of her body. She surveyed the room with the calm of someone who knew exactly where each piece stood. She found Mira within 30 seconds. A single glance, brief and conclusive, like a line drawn through an item on a list. Her expression conveyed, in the vocabulary of the fan and the lifted chin, something the Baroness had voiced in plain words. "Nobody, my dear." Mira kept her eyes on the window. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, but the change in the room's sound, the slight adjustment that a room makes when a person of considerable authority enters it. The conversations did not stop, but they shifted, became slightly louder in the registers, where people were performing their ease, and slightly quieter in the registers, where they were genuinely attending to something. She turned her face very carefully toward the center of the room, and she saw Edmund Carew, Duke of Ashbourne, enter from the east door. He came directly across the room. He did not stop at the door to survey his acquaintance. He did not deflect toward Lord Fenwick, who was standing near the fireplace, and who lifted a hand in greeting that went unacknowledged. He did not turn toward the dowager, who stood very still at the far end of the room with Cecily at her hand, her painted fan suspended at exactly the height that signaled expectation. He walked. 3 strides, 4, 5, the floor clearing ahead of him with the small invisible adjustments that crowds make around rank, and then he was in front of the window where Mira was standing, and the room went very quiet in the particular way it had gone quiet once before on the first night of the season. He bowed. It was, if anything, more deliberate than the first time. There was nothing casual in it, no ambiguity about its target. He bowed to Mira Voss, companion, in her gray gown with the Baroness's fan in her hands, before every person of consequence in the room, and he held the bow for a full measured second before he straightened. Lord Fenwick was watching from the fireplace, his hand still half raised from the greeting that had gone unreturned. He was watching with the sharp attention of a man who understood that what he was witnessing would be repeated and confirmed, and entered into the season's understanding before the week was out, and his expression held something between surprise and a very dry approval. "Miss Voss?" Edmund said. His voice carried no particular elevation, and it needed none. The room was quiet enough that the words reached the east wall. "I received your letter." She could not speak for a moment. The fan was very solid in her hands, a specific material fact she held on to, while the rest of the room organized itself into something she could not yet process. "Your Grace," she managed, "you wrote that you had never understood yourself to have a claim on anyone's notice." He said it precisely, the way she had written it, and it sounded, spoken aloud in a quiet room, like a thing that required correction. "I am here to dispute that." The fan, the window, the gray gown, the room. She heard the dowager's painted fan close, a small, crisp sound like a sentence ending. "You will do me the honor," Edmund said, "of the next dance. And if you are willing, when the dancing is concluded, I would like to speak with you and the Baroness together about a matter I have already taken the liberty of arranging." She understood in that moment that he was telling her something concrete. Not a compliment, not a flattery, not a gentleman's meaningless courtesy extended to a woman he found temporarily interesting. He was telling her that he had already done a thing, that the thing was specific and material and irrevocable, and that the arrangement was one she would need to hear and respond to. "Yes," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. She did not know how. He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked toward the center of the room, and the crowd parted for them with the slow, involuntary respect that crowds extend to things they have just been required to revise their understanding of. The dowager stood very still. Her fan remained closed in her hand. Beside her, Cecily had composed her face into an expression of perfect, practiced serenity, the expression of a young woman who had been raised to maintain it under pressure, and was maintaining it now, though the cost was visible at the corners of her eyes. She was not cruel, Cecily, and she would recover, and she was simply a young woman who had been told, often and reliably, that the room was arranged for her benefit, and was learning tonight that the room's arrangements were subject to revision. The dowager's calculation played out in a single short clause behind her composed face. She had misread the variable. She had managed every correct piece, and misread the central one. Edmund, watching, had seen something she had not measured in her accounting, and the accounting had come out differently than it should have. Lord Fenwick approached the dowager with the measured step of a man who understood what his witnessing meant. "Margaret," he said, using the name that confirmed both his seniority and his gentleness, "I believe we may call that settled." There was no triumph in it. There was only the recognition of a man who had spent 50 years watching the correct weight finally land on the correct side of a scale. The Baroness found Mira's elbow the moment the dance concluded. Her face had undergone a rapid series of recalculations, the results of which had settled into a careful neutrality. "He wishes to speak with us both," Mira told her, before the Baroness could speak first. "Yes?" the Baroness said. She looked at Mira with an expression that was not quite an apology, and not quite its opposite, and then she smoothed her own expression into the particular blankness of a practical woman absorbing a situation she had not predicted. "I see." The three of them withdrew to the small sitting room off the main hall, where the fire was low and a footman had left a tray of wine that nobody touched. Edmund stood with his back to the fireplace in the way of tall men in small rooms, and he spoke plainly, in the manner she had noticed was his habit when the occasion permitted it. He had written to the Academy in Bath that morning. The debt of £240 had been settled from his own account. Thomas Voss would complete his year without interruption. The letter of confirmation would reach Bath by Friday. He paused here because he was watching her face, and what was on her face was not gratitude, which would have been manageable, but the specific expression of someone who had been carrying a particular weight for so long that its removal had produced a physical response she was not prepared for. Her eyes were very bright. She said nothing. "I would like," Edmund said, "to speak to you again, at Ashbourne, if you will come. I am returning next week, and I am asking if you will come with a proper party, the Baroness included, and stay for a fortnight. And allow me to ask you a question I am not ready to ask in a sitting room at Viscount Holt's assembly." The Baroness made a small sound that was not quite speech. "I am not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. He was looking at Mira. "I am asking you to come." She thought about the letter she had written, and the word departure, and the conviction she had written it from. She thought about a corridor and a stone floor, and a child's miniature retrieved from the dark. She thought about the specific quality of his stillness, which she had read as coldness for 3 weeks and was now reading in the changed light of a sitting room with a low fire as something that had required a great deal of effort to maintain. "Yes," she said, "I will come. If you have found your way to this story and are still with Mira now, consider leaving a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. Stories like this one are built in the quiet hours, and knowing which beats land is a genuine help. Now let us see how it ended. Ashbourne sat in the Wiltshire countryside under a sky that had been promising rain for 3 days and finally delivered it on the Thursday of the second week of Mira's visit, a soft, steady autumn rain that came in off the hills and made the estate feel enclosed and particular and very far from London. She had been given a room in the east wing with windows that faced the kitchen garden, and she had spent the first 2 days moving carefully through the house's rhythms, learning where the light was good in the afternoons and where the drafts collected, and which of the 2 sitting rooms the housekeeper preferred for the household's use. She was, she recognized, doing what she had always done, cataloging a place she was not sure she was permitted to stay in, preparing for the moment when her usefulness expired. Edmund had not yet asked his question. He had been present, at meals and in the library, and on the walk he took each morning along the eastern wall of the park, and he had been, in all of these settings, more fully present than she had seen him in London. The estate's rhythm suited him in a way that the season's rooms had not. His jaw still held its set line, but there were moments, riding back from the home farm with his steward, or stopping on the walk to look across the valley, when the line released slightly, and she saw what was underneath it, which was not coldness at all, but a very careful attention. On the 4th day, he showed her the portrait. They were in the corridor outside the study, and he stopped in front of the empty hook, or what she had assumed was an empty hook, and she saw that the frame was turned face to the wall, the dark wood backing visible, the brass hook just visible above it. He stood looking at it for a moment, and then he said, without preface, "That is Eleanor." She said nothing, because nothing was required. "She died 2 years ago in the autumn," he said. "I was at Westminster. I had calculated that the child was 3 weeks away, and that the drainage legislation would be concluded in 4 days, and that the arithmetic was therefore sound." He paused. The arithmetic was not sound. The rain moved across the windows at the end of the corridor. A candle in the wall sconce threw a long shadow from the frame to the floor. "I have kept it turned," he said, "because it seemed correct to keep it turned until I was certain I had learned what it was trying to teach me." Mira looked at the frame and at his face in profile, and at the specific quality of a man who had held himself to account for 2 years with the kind of rigor that other men reserved for their tenants or their accounts, and never turned on themselves. "What is it trying to teach you?" she asked. He looked at her then, the gray eyes direct, the line of his jaw releasing fully for the first time. "That the correct weight in a scale is not always the one that serves the most people," he said. "Sometimes it is simply the one that is standing in front of you." She held his gaze for a moment, that was longer than propriety required, and shorter than she wanted. He reached up, and he turned the portrait to face the wall correctly, which is to say, he turned it outward, so that Eleanor's face looked into the corridor again, painted in the warm colors of some years ago, a young woman with a direct expression and a strand of coral beads at her throat. It was, Mira understood, not a dismissal. It was a restoration. The portrait had been turned as a form of self-punishment, and turning it back was the declaration that the punishment had reached its end. He asked his question the following morning, in the library, before the fire had been properly established, and while the rain was still soft against the glass, and she answered it with the same precision she had brought to every honest thing she had ever said. She said yes. She said it the way she had said it twice before, without elaboration, because the word was complete on its own. Thomas arrived at Ashbourne on the Friday before they departed for London to arrange the legal formalities. Brought up from Bath on the coach with a letter from his academy confirming his fees were settled and his standing very good. He was 15 and taller than she had expected, and he had their father's directness of expression and a new coat that still smelled of the shop, and when he saw her in the entrance hall, he crossed it in 3 strides and held on for a moment that neither of them found embarrassing. Edmund waited in the doorway of the library and said nothing while this happened, because he had learned the value of waiting for the correct moment. Thomas shook his hand afterward with the gravity of someone attempting to be older than 15, and Edmund shook it back with equal gravity, and nothing further was required. The legal arrangements were concluded in London in 10 days. Lord Fenwick was present at the formal proceedings in the capacity of a senior peer whose presence confirmed the legitimacy of what was being done, and he signed his name beneath Edmund's with the air of a man tidying up a matter that had already been decided. The Baroness was present also, and released Mira from her situation with a handsomeness that was partly genuine and partly the social intelligence of a woman who understood which direction the wind had moved. They returned to Ashbourne in November, as the first snow of the season came down across the valley in the thin preliminary way of early winter. Not the heavy snow that settles and transforms, but the kind that merely suggests what is coming. Mira stood at the window of the room that was now hers. The window that looked east across the kitchen garden and the home farm, and the valley where the light was beginning to go out for the evening, and she held in her hands the copy of Johnson's dictionary that had been the only book she'd managed to keep. She opened it to the inside cover. The piece of paper was still there, folded where she had always kept it, with £240 written at the top in her own hand. She stood with it for a long moment. The number had been settled weeks ago, in a practical and irreversible way, and the paper was now nothing but paper. The weight she had carried from Wiltshire to London to this window had been replaced by something she did not yet have a word for, which was not happiness precisely, since happiness suggested lightness, and what she felt was heavier than that, more specific, more tethered to the material world. She heard his step in the corridor outside, the particular sound she had learned to identify in 3 weeks of the house's rhythms, and she folded the paper and placed it back inside the cover, because it still meant something, even if what it meant had changed. He opened the door and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the snow continued to fall outside the east window, thin and preliminary, suggesting what was coming. "Thomas wrote," she said. "He has been made junior prefect." Edmund's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, since smiling was a thing he did rarely and deliberately, but it was the thing that preceded one, the slight release at the corners that meant something had reached him. She had seen it twice before, and both times it had struck her as more significant than any of the season's performed felicities. "Good," he said. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out together at the kitchen garden under its first dusting of snow, and at the valley going gray and quiet in the evening, and at the hills beyond it that were the property's eastern boundary and beyond, which the rest of the world was arranging itself without their assistance. She held the dictionary lightly, her thumb resting on its spine. He had come to find her, as he had come each evening of the past 3 weeks at this particular hour, not summoning her, not requesting, simply appearing, because he had decided she was where he wished to be. That was all. And that was not a small thing at all.